Thank you. So we saw from the poll at the start of the day that planning, if it's not the top barrier to good architecture, is a frustration for architects. And the planning system or planners themselves have come in for a lot of criticism over the last decade or so, even labelled the enemies of enterprise by David Cameron. But somehow the sport of planner bashing hasn't improved the situation. It turns out that calling planners the enemies of enterprise is a surefire way of getting less enterprising people in planning departments. That's obviously one of the reasons that Pooja and I set up public practice, to create a shift from complaining about the planning system from the outside to trying to improve it from the inside and celebrating what it actually does do well. And I've always thought of planning a bit like a really complicated, kind of archaic musical instrument. So when I joined Croydon Council, I really had no idea how it worked. And I spent the first year just really getting to grips with the mechanics of the system, which of course are very unintuitive. But once I learned how to pretty much play it without looking, I could start to make it do what I wanted and actually produce some all right results. And that's what these next two sessions are about, learning how the machinery of the planning system really works to be able to work your way around it. So first we're going to hear some tactics for navigating the planning system from 4 of the public practice associates: Akil Scaife-Smith, Rachel Hearn, Jen Gutteridge and Lucia Serrada Morato. All 4 are part of the first cohort of 17 associates, and they were selected from over 200 applicants for year-long placements on the front line of local government. And all 4 have backgrounds in architecture and design, previously worked in private practice. So they're going to talk through 4 stages of the planning process: consultation, pre-application, submission and post-application. And just to give you a warning, this isn't going to be official or authoritative guidance on how the system works. Certainly won't represent what their authorities would say on the matter. And also, I should point out, they're only 7 months into their placements in any case. But instead, we've asked them to give you an insight into what they've learned so far from seeing the system from the inside. So first up is Akil Scaife-Smith, and he's going to be talking about consultation and engagement. So Akil is an urban designer and researcher, co-founder of the Resolve Collective. And through public practice, Akil has joined the brilliant place-shaping team in Croydon Council, where he's leading on the design and delivery of a really innovative programme of meanwhile public realm and cultural projects in central Croydon. So please welcome Akil. Thank you.
Okay. So, I'm just going to talk a little bit about engagement and about the various types of engagement and how, as architects, we can engage not only with the stakeholders of the developments, but the planning system itself. So, when is engagement necessary? In my experience, schemes of different sizes and scales necessitate perhaps not different levels of engagement, but quite fluid shifts in the type of engagement and who are engaged. However, the question of when, as architects, you should engage stays fairly rigid. Engagement is a continual process. Engagement in the capacity of community engagement, everything from entirely unengaging planning notices to the variety of engaging techniques tested through various meanwhile spaces and new technologies, is often not that useful in reflecting who is in need of being engaged. In its initial stages, before even pre-app stages, we as the council need to be engaged. Croydon and a number of other London boroughs encourage applicants to submit pre-applications through which we can work collaboratively through a number of design, conservation and planning issues. However, prior even to this, it's worth expressing your interest and dropping the relevant council a phone call. Even just this, especially with sites of interest, and your interest in them as designers and architects can be aided at the earliest possible engagement with authorities, and also help us strategize these areas. At the other end, although famously overlooked, post-occupancy evaluations present a type of engagement at the end of the physical building process that is of great importance. Architects and developers building in boroughs that are striving to meet housing targets are inevitably drawn back to those environments, as we, the planning departments, are inevitably re-encounter you. A proven track record of well-designed and well-lived-in development is becoming increasingly valued as a currency of development as it moves at its pace. Who are your stakeholders? So here I like to envisage this task not only as a way of understanding who is currently informing the design of your development, but who will inform it in the future. Present stakeholders might range from the councillors, to the resident associations, to local dog walkers, to the newt that will potentially make all your plans go pear-shaped, and everyone in between. But future stakeholders are just as important to anticipate and manage. As a really simple example, developments in built areas with 70% 3 beds, which Croydon has a lot of, will inevitably host a lot of young children, who will themselves be stakeholders in the building and the local area. Showing on a number of scales how your design responds to the changing demographic, how children might access and navigate the building using play as functions of various ages as a way of driving the landscape decisions. They're all really powerful real-time illustrations of our policies and how they might shape a place. For me, these kind of details are very much a multifaceted engagement process with the authority and its present demands and with future stakeholders. Tools of engagement. Oh, I'm going to skip this slide. Tools of engagement. With in mind who is being engaged and who you are doing the engagement with, the type of engagement necessary, there are a variety of tools at your disposal as architects. Meanwhile space can be a very powerful way of testing the potentials for permanent development or understanding the character of an area, and it's not only limited to huge schemes. It's the timing of a scheme, rather than its size, which should determine how you plan for meanwhile projects. How you facilitate these temporary engagement and who leads them, what you want to derive from them are all of great importance at very early stages in determining your meanwhile spaces. And it's easy to understand them as only placeholders or worse, cover-ups, both which hold little potential for engagement. Technology is also becoming a growing part of how we engage, and it also shapes who we can engage with, broadening this demographic at times, but also narrowing it. Initiatives like Future Cities Catapult, Trial Test, a number of innovative digital engagement methods that, although we haven't witnessed at our particular council, certainly set a lot of applications apart. It's also worth saying, though, that technological dependence is not a ubiquitous trait, and many communities and community groups are not immediately reachable through apps, through digital programs, and even mail. Old school, visible engagement, getting to know existing residents in their needs and wants, sitting down with tea for local groups, and documenting this is often a foolproof way of deriving substantial insight into what matters in shaping a place. Oh, and I wanted to finish on a last quote, which was, are we designing for our client or wider society? Is our site the red line boundary or the place of which it's part of? Our buildings finish when they are open or when they are just standing? This is a quote by Finn Williams in his last article in the Zine. It really shapes a lot of how we look at planning and how we look at applications across the borough. Looking at an application strategically from your side, as well as envisioning how we as a local authority look at it, is of crucial importance in very early application stages. Understanding your development not just as a 2-bed or a 3-bed, not as a collection of units, but as a place that's integral and a part of the rest of that, and communicating that at very early stages is something that I've found to be an incredibly successful tactic. Definitely.
Thanks, Akil. So next we have Rachel Hearn talking about the pre-app stage. Rachel's an architect. She's worked at a number of practices, including most recently Stanton Williams, initiated and led a co-housing project and taught at several universities. We placed Rachel in the London Borough of Havering as their first in-house design expertise in living memory. And as far as I can tell, she's involved in pretty much everything Havering are doing, from design advice on a major estate regeneration programme to setting up a design review panel, starting up a master plan for Romford, and many other things. So please welcome Rachel.
So I wanted to start with this quote from the MPPF, not a document that we look at all the time, but I think there's some cynicism about the pre-app process and whether it's anything worth doing. But the MPPF does say it should enable better coordination between public and private resources and improved outcomes for the community, which I think builds on what Akil has been saying. So what I wanted to start with is just to think about the psychology of not submitting a pre-app. There's sort of really limited resources in planning at the moment, so if you don't submit a pre-app and try and negotiate during the submission, you're often sort of met with, oh, why are they doing this? Why didn't they do it properly? By case officers. And it's also often really useful to bring the client to the pre-app meeting, because what you hear firsthand is often quite different to the sort of bland summary that you get in the letter where no one really wants to commit to anything. And secondly, it's really important, it's kind of blindingly obvious, but to engage early. The more complex the scheme, the earlier you need to come in. And like Akil was saying, even just you're thinking about a project, what you think the brief might be for a site, it's often really valuable to hear from you at that stage. The second thing is the document or whatever you send in is often looked at before you arrive. It will be judged before you get there. So produce a properly collated document. Often we get a kind of series of random PDFs which get scanned in, come to you in a weird order, and someone starts judging you on that. So collate it and kind of edit how you're going to present it. You want to make a good case before you get there. And as a follow-on from that, don't write lots. People write tons. No one has time to read this stuff. Be realistic about what time a design officer or a case officer is going to spend on your proposal. It's not very much. Also, planning officers, they don't always think in 3D. Particularly when it comes to constraints, we often get drawings with loads of wiggly lines on about noise here, something here. It's really helpful to put the constraints in 3D and be really transparent about what the constraints are, and what the brief is in that respect. It can be really valuable to try and build relationships through a pre-app. You get to know a case officer and potentially a design officer. And when it comes to submission, if you've got to know somebody on a personal level, it does make the whole thing a lot easier. No one in planning is going to write any kind of agenda for this meeting. You're going to turn up. You'll be lucky if they've looked at the document before. Hopefully they will have. So it's your opportunity to structure the meeting, try and get out of it what you want, agree what the initial site findings were, discuss what the constraints are, and talk them through what the possible solutions are. You're trying to get the planning officer to share your vision for the site, because if you can get them to buy into it, then the whole thing will be a lot smoother. But also be open to listening how specific policies might be applied to your site, and don't think you know everything. It's really difficult if the architect comes across in a defensive manner in these meetings, because people resist saying what they really think. And take the opportunity, it kind of seems quite obvious, but agree with them what the principles of community engagement would be, agree what the design principles are, and try and get out of the meeting something useful, and the letter not just to say a kind of regurgitation of what all the planning policies are on your site, because everyone knows you can look that up yourself, but planning officers will resort to that if you don't try and lead the meeting. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Rachel. So now we've got Jennifer Gutteridge speaking about the stage from submission of the planning application to decision. So Jen is an urban designer with a background in architecture, including working for Herzog and de Meuron in the past. Jen is now placed in the new Royal Docs team at the GLA as the design advisor, where her role involves taking a great estates approach to transforming the quality of place at the docks, in particular rethinking the use of water and how the public realm fits together. Over to Jen.
Okay, thanks. So from submission to determination, so that's that window of time once you've sent your submission off into the ether, and I'm going to try and give you some tactics for things you might be able to do during that period, and also give a bit of an idea towards how planners approach their decision-making process. So 3 tactics, 3 themes on tactics: negotiation, amendments, and withdrawals. So negotiation, I mean, this is, I think, a sort of repeating message that we're saying, see it as a good thing. It's an opportunity to find out as much as you can about what the planner is thinking, what their concerns are, and it gives you an opportunity to be creative about how you can resolve those issues. So try to get to know your case officers and managers. It's within the interest of the authority to give you the same case officer at pre-app as they do at application, because it makes everything faster. But I do know that the turnover of case officers at some boroughs is really high. So do try to get to know their managers as well if you can, because they are the people that are signing off those applications or signing off those decision notices. So they'll be really familiar with your projects as well. Make the most of windows that open up for negotiations, such as amendments, and use this to build trust. So if a planner phones you up, really grab that opportunity to show that you're collaborative and show that you want to make the application work, because this really can work in your favour. Also, on the other side, seek opportunities for feedback wherever possible, in the sense that you can also initiate those conversations as well. So don't be afraid to touch base with your case officer. I've said at strategic points in the determination period. So, for example, determination periods for smaller projects is 8 weeks. And say you've submitted a small scheme that's a bit tricky, it's in the conservation area, and you might have a few left of field materials involved. Don't be afraid, if you hear nothing for 6 weeks, don't be afraid to give them a call and to see how it's going, because by that point, most likely the case officer will know where that application is going. It's probably a case that they just haven't written the report yet, and you might be able to do something about it. Also, the phone is a really useful tool to have those looser, more informal conversations with planners and conservation officers and urban design officers. Much more informal than doing everything by email, as obviously they're much more careful about what they put in writing. Amendments. So amendments within the determination process is highly discretionary, so each borough tends to have a different view on it, mainly because generally they make the process much longer, and also a scheme that's amended bit by bit over a short period of time generally doesn't end up being an amazing scheme. So generally speaking, small alterations only. It should lead to a consent. They're not going to ask you for lots of amendments if they don't want to approve your application. In some cases, amendments are used for borderline schemes. So planners tend towards the risk averse, and when you get a borderline scheme, their incentive is to try and make this work for them. They want to approve it, because fundamentally, if this application is refused and if the applicant then takes it to appeal, there's so little control over what that planning inspector will think, and some policies are less robust than others, etc. It opens them up to scrutiny. Unsuccessful appeals for local authorities are recorded, so it's something that they don't want to be unsuccessful with. And I know some boroughs record this individually, so it can affect a case officer's personal record. So I think just be aware of that context. I don't know if planners would like me to tell you all that, but there we go. And finally, withdrawals. So with withdrawals, there's a cynical way of looking at it, and there's also a very positive way. I'll start with the slightly more cynical version. So like, they're a time saver. Withdrawals, the minute that you withdraw your application, the case is closed. No more work needs to be done, no more administration. It saves everyone time. So do be aware of, if a planner rings you up and asks you to withdraw, be aware of when within this determination period this is happening. It's not really my experience, but I have heard that. So say if a case officer calls you up and tries to convince you to withdraw your application, if your application is about to be determined in the next 2 or 3 days, that's not saving you any time, really. So I think just be aware of where that sort of sits, and they might be saving themselves more time. And be aware of your right to appeal. If you withdraw your application, you can't appeal it. So again, back to that appeals process, that is protecting local authorities from appeals. Saying that, I've been in lots of situations where withdrawals are actually quite a positive thing. If I mean, especially if we are getting applicants and it's their 4th attempt and it's definitely going to be a refusal, it's quite useful to call them up quite early on in the determination process and say, you know, we think we will refuse your planning application. We'd like it if you withdrew and came back for pre-app. Because if the applicant doesn't withdraw, the case officer and all the urban design officer or the conservation officer will spend the rest of that time making a very robust negative report that will stand up in a planning appeal. So fundamentally, as an applicant, you'll get a very critical negative report, which is basically maybe not as constructive as going into a pre-app process. So finally, withdrawing can improve relationships between the planner and the applicant. So if you agree to withdraw early in the determination process, you can say to the planner or the case officer, yeah, fine, I will withdraw, but I'd like to see you for pre-app in the next 2 weeks because, you know, this project's got a tight, program. You might be able to use that to sort of square an early pre-app rather than waiting a month and a half. So within that 8-week determination period, you might be able to withdraw, come back in for pre-app and get pre-app advice rather than sitting and waiting for a refusal. And I think that's all from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. So finally in this section, Lucia. So Lucia is an urban designer and academic with also a background in architecture. Lucia worked at McKenna Lavington Architects for a number of years and is currently completing a PhD at the Bartlett School of Planning. She joined the place shaping team in Tower Hamlets Council, where she's helping the Place Directorate develop best practice guidance for high density development. I should also say that all of the associates spend 10% of their year taking part in a program of collective research and development, and Lucia is actually researching how to secure design quality at the post-application stage, so very relevant for this presentation.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus the presentation around tactics on different aspects of post-permission. So I'm going to start with conditions and section 106 around application time. Then I'm going to look into discharge of conditions and material and non-material amendments. So to start with, in regards to conditions, the average number of conditions, it is 45. So this refers to bigger schemes, but I think proportionally to smaller and medium scale projects, the amount of conditions is quite high. So as you might be aware, there is a new legislation, so the Neighborhood Planning Act, that is trying to change this. So it's trying to reduce the amount of conditions. So on the top of the slide, you can see how usually the system works. So you have you submit a limited amount of information at permission, drawings at 1 to 100 scale, and that relies heavily on having quite a lot of conditions to deal with all the details that haven't been provided. And then what happens is the discharge of conditions are clustered around the pre-start and then also pre-occupation, which makes the whole construction or implementation of the scheme quite slow. So I think the new legislation, what it's trying to do is try and front-load the amount of information that is submitted at permission, but then also staggering the discharge of conditions along the timeline. So the way they're doing this is by having applicants to agree with the conditions, the pre-commencement conditions. So when the officer wants to set up a pre-commencement condition, they have to send it to you, and you need to respond in 10 days saying either I agree or disagree. So that means that conversations are encouraged between both local authorities and yourselves to make the planning system work better. So I think it is quite important, or I would suggest that you look at conditions as a live document, not as a given or a static element. So you can ask, and I have seen this at Tower Hamlets, you can ask officers to send you the draft conditions quite early in the process, so at pre-app, and you can start looking into them, making suggestions, or even considering front-loading information in order to reduce the amount of conditions you have. So this is one thing that might help after post-permission. Then it's also worth mentioning that some local authorities use clauses at section 106 to try and lock in design. So the main ones are the retention of architect clause, but also the design certifier. So it might be worth, if you think that you know or you suspect that you are not going to be innovated, you can start having conversations with officers to try and ask them to include these clauses in the section 106. So you could keep, after permission is granted, some sort of control over the design of the scheme. Now moving into discharge of conditions, as Rachel and Jen were mentioning, so the resources at local authorities are very scarce, and if they spend or they have little time at pre-app stage, let alone post-permission and discharge of conditions. So the time they spend is very limited. And then it is also worth mentioning that the continuity of officers is not something that happens. So the officers looking at the discharge conditions might not be the same as the ones that were involved. So keeping this in mind, I think it's important for you to submit when discharging conditions simple, concise, succinct information that is clear and easy to read and navigate for the officer. Also, at the discharge condition stage, I am aware that sometimes the conversations between the local authority and the applicant could be quite complicated. Maybe, you know, they say, or officers believe that applicants do not understand what is needed to discharge a condition. So in order to ease the process, it might be worth to asking your client to have a planning consultant on board so they can help you understand what exactly is needed to discharge the condition. Or if they are not willing to have a consultant, maybe you can explore the option of entering a pre-app meeting to discharge conditions. I think this, for officers, it's seen as a goodwill gesture, and you know that you are willing to make the whole discharge of conditions easy and quick for them. And then on the last one, material and non-material amendments. So based on the research I've done so far with public practice, and I have spoken with different local authorities, what I can say is that the criteria to decide whether an amendment is material or non-material is quite varied, so there is not much consistency between different local authorities. Some of them take a more subjective approach, so if they think the change is for good, they might be willing to go down the route of non-material amendment, but others have like a more like a stringent approach, so if there is any sort of change in height, volume, they are quite firmly want to go down the material amendment route. So it's quite difficult to give you, tips for this, but I think it is worth trying to have like a strategic approach. So have an honest conversation with your client, see how many changes are they willing to do, how much stuff do they want you to add, or what is needed, and it might be worth to have a pre-application also, meeting to present a minor or material amendment and have an honest conversation with the officer, trying to explain why these changes are happening, and also be aware that sometimes officers get a bit annoyed if they receive lots of minor amendment, minor material applications, because they see that the cumulative impact might be like material, so it might be worth to group all of them and have this conversation and agree. So it might help you to be more successful. And that's it. Thank you.
Switch on these mics, that's better, thank you. So very quickly, because we really only got 4 or 5 minutes, I'm just going to take a couple of questions from Slido, and thanks for people putting them up. We've got a number of questions here around the pre-app process, and a number about how you can access pre-app advice, particularly face-to-face meetings, in the context of authorities being under-resourced or often not offering good services for smaller scale schemes. So I wonder, Rachel, if you could just talk a bit about the research you've been doing on pre-application advice across London, and any useful lessons from that about how architects can engage with the variety of different pre-app services that are offered.
Yeah, it is really tricky because most authorities are so stretched for resources that they're not really willing to do things unless someone's going to pay for them, which is quite a cynical way of looking at it. So just expecting to be able to pick up the phone and speak to someone is quite rare. I don't know too many places where you can do that unless, and that's why I talked about building relationships during the process, because particularly if you're working in a borough where you're submitting multiple schemes, they're most likely to have a conversation with you if they've worked with you on another project and know that you're someone half decent and kind of good to deal with, because it makes their life easier. So it's quite important as you go through the stages on other projects not to get people's backs up, and like when they ask you to withdraw and things like that, to work with them, because it's often in your interests in other times. And also remember that there is this big churn of case officers, so often people that you've worked with somewhere turn up somewhere else. So just because you got someone's back up at a particular authority, they could yet turn up somewhere else. So kind of be mindful of that, and everyone does know everyone. It's a bit like architecture. It's a really small world of people moving around between different boroughs. So I'd say, not wanting to be too cynical, being able to pick up the phone is quite rare. I don't know whether other people would...
It's worth also mentioning other forms of engagement, particularly, for example, through RIBA regions, where you've got applicant panels or groups, forms which enable where working with authorities the opportunity to meet officers from a number of different councils, and talk through changes to policy or issues that are coming up, and I think they can be really good forums to establish those kind of more informal relationships. Question also around, we'll hear from Mark Benzie, how do you ensure consistency between pre-app advice and how local authorities determine applications? I'd say the advice changes 90% of the time. Jen, because you were talking about that link between pre-app and application.
So when a case officer is giving advice, they're often gathering comments from maybe 3 or 4, maybe more, different officers from different areas. So I think the first thing is to identify who's saying what. More times than not, it's often design advice, because design is quite subjective, and design policy, depending on the borough, can be open to interpretation. So it might not be the case that speaking to the case officer is the right thing. You might have to go to the heritage officer or the urban design officer, and I think the best way to do it is, you have to speak out about it and highlight the inconsistency. You should have a pre-app letter in writing that you'll be able to show them. Most councils do have a clause that says their pre-app advice isn't the be-all end-all, because they do have to have that kind of get-out clause. If they get pre-app advice wrong, in my experience, they often offer free pre-app services. So it's a situation that every authority doesn't want to be in. They do not want to give inconsistent advice. So if they find themselves doing it, and especially if it's really dramatically different advice, you are usually entitled to some kind of, free service back. So I think just be aware of what you can get back from it, but it does happen.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but hopefully some of the associates will be around, so you can grab them at lunch, or indeed contact Public Practice, where we've got a whole network of associates working across London, the south, east and east of England. And I suppose that picks up on one other question here. The positive picture painted does not reflect reality. The reality of many planning departments, pre-app feedback not received, officers uncontactable. What will change this? So all I'd say to that is, well, finally, after years of lobbying, there is an uplift in planning fees, which should start to make a difference. It's still doesn't represent the true costs of processing plan applications, but it's a step in the right direction. There's other funding being made available to local authorities, like planning delivery funding, and as public practice spreads, perhaps we'll start to make a difference that way as well. So tell your local authorities about public practice. Thank you to all of the associates, and we'll move on to the next section.